Nestled among the golden hills of California's Napa Valley, where vineyards spread like carpets of green beneath a mostly blue sky, the Langston Mansion stood as a monument to opulence and, more recently, to mourning and mystery. The estate, known for its award-winning wines and the architectural beauty of its main house, once exuded an aura of ancient wealth. But over the past year, a palpable shadow had settled over its immaculate gardens and hushed salons. Since the tragic and still murky death of Garrett Langston's young and vibrant wife, Amelia, during a horseback ride, under circumstances that many considered suspicious, the millionaire owner of the world-renowned winery had become a ghostly figure. Once a man of standing in social and business circles, Garrett now lived a reclusive life, a hermit in his own castle, a prisoner of a grief that seemed insurmountable and of secrets that the constant breeze of the valley could not dispel. It was in this setting of seclusion and melancholy that Sara Delgado and her 7-year-old daughter Emily arrived at the Langston Mansion. Sara, a woman in her early 30s, with a look that carried the sweetness and resilience of someone who had already faced many battles in life, had been hired as the new housekeeper, a position she had accepted more out of the pressing need to support her daughter than out of the aspiration of working in such a fraught environment. Emily, on the other hand, was a girl with a sharp intelligence and an introspective nature, almost calculated in her silence. Her large brown eyes seemed to absorb every detail of the new environment, every nuance in the behavior of the few adults who crossed her path in the sumptuous corridors. While her mother struggled to adapt to the demands of her new role and the heavy atmosphere of the house, Emily, often invisible to the hurried and worried eyes of her elders, began to develop the habit of exploring the nooks and crannies of the vast property, her small nocturnal forays becoming a silent and secret routine. The routine at Langston Mansion was governed by a cold formality and an almost oppressive discretion. The few servants who still served in the house moved like shadows, speaking in low voices, avoiding any gesture or word that might disturb the mourning and isolation of their master. Garrett Langston was rarely seen. He spent most of his time locked in his office, a vast, dark room on the second floor, from which emanated at times the muffled sound of melancholy classical music or the heavy silence of a grief that refused to subside. His only regular company seemed to be Dr. Theo March, a distinguished-looking, soft-spoken psychologist hired to help him process the loss of Amelia and his mother, the imposing Ruth Langston, a 71-year-old matriarch whose frequent visits and palpable influence over the family business were a constant in that secluded environment. Sara, in her early days, felt the weight of that collective sadness, but she tried hard to maintain a professional air, focused on her tasks and protecting Emily from that dense atmosphere. Emily, with the curiosity inherent to her age and a capacity for observation that went far beyond her 7 years, soon realized that the Langston Mansion was a place of secrets and unspoken words. While her mother was busy with the complex logistics of the house, the girl found in the long corridors, the empty halls and the labyrinthine gardens a vast territory for her silent explorations. She was not looking for adventure in the traditional sense. She was looking to understand, to decipher the codes of that adult world that seemed so strange and at times frightening to her. She collected fragments of conversations she had overheard, observed the glances exchanged between the servants, Ruth Langston's tense gestures during her visits, the way Dr. March entered and left Garrett's office with a folder that he never let go of. And in her sketchbook, which was her refuge and her secret diary, she not only painted the flowers in the garden or the birds she saw through the window, but she also wrote down in her childish and hesitant handwriting words and phrases that caught her attention even if she did not fully understand their meaning. On one of those sultry Californian summer nights, when the house was immersed in the silence that followed the adults' retreat, Emily wandered the hallways of the ground floor, the worn-out rag, a doll that was her only confidant under her arm. She had drawn a new drawing to hide in her secret hiding place, a loose space beneath the grand oak staircase that led to the second floor, a place known only to her. As she approached the stairs, her steps light so as not to attract anyone's attention, she heard voices coming from Garrett's office, whose door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light escaping into the dark hallway. Curiosity, stronger than the fear of being caught, made her stop and listen, and what she heard that night would not only confirm her childish intuitions that something strange was happening in that house, but would also throw her into the center of a dangerous and complex plot, far beyond anything her 7-year-old imagination could conceive. The voices were unmistakable. Ruth Langston, her paternal grandmother, with her controlled, authoritative tone, and Dr. Theo March, the psychologist, with his soft, carefully chosen words. But the tenor of the conversation was nothing like a therapy session or a discussion about Garrett's well-being. Instead, what Emily began to listen to, her heart pounding and her breath catching, was a cold, detailed description of a plan to convince Garrett, and by extension the world, that he was losing his mind, that his grief over Amelia's death had developed into crippling mental instability. They talked about fabricated symptoms, about tailored medical reports, about the need for legal intervention to protect the estate. Emily, hiding in the shadow of the staircase, felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't care. It was something much darker. His deep grief is our greatest ally, Theo. Ruth Langston's voice was clear and sharp, devoid of any trace of maternal emotion. We only need to emphasize his confusion, his lethargy. Are the new medications you've introduced, the ones with the placebo effect and the ones that enhance the feeling of disorientation, working? Emily heard Dr. March respond, with his usual professional calm, but there was a hint of collusion in his words that made her shiver. Yes, Ruth, the adjustments in the medication are having the desired effect. Garrett reports more episodes of mental confusion, memory lapses, and increasing apathy. Our medical records will corroborate a case of deep depression with psychotic features induced by the trauma. The interdiction will be just a formality, a measure to protect him from himself and his impulsive decisions. Emily continued to listen, paralyzed by horror and disbelief. Ruth Langston then detailed the financial side of the plan. Once we have secured Garrett's legal incapacity and I have been appointed his guardian, we will begin the secret transfer of the winery's most important assets to that shell trust we have set up in Luxembourg. In the eyes of the public and creditors, this will be a measure to protect the family's assets during Garrett's instability. But in reality, it will be the first step towards us, Theos, taking full control and being able to renegotiate the sale of the Langston estate to investors more aligned with our interests, without the emotional interference and restrictions that Garrett imposes. The coldness with which mother and doctor discussed Garrett's ruin was frightening. Emily, with her childish mind, didn't understand all the terms: legal incapacity, interdiction, confidential transfer, shell fund. But she understood the essence of that conversation. They wanted to take everything from Garrett, deceive him, make him look crazy. With trembling legs and a racing heart, Emily retreated silently, away from the office door as if fleeing a ghost. She returned to her small room, the ragdoll forgotten in the hallway, and sought refuge in her sketchbook. But instead of painting flowers or animals, she began to write, in her still uncertain handwriting, the words and phrases that echoed in her mind. Legal incapacity, interdiction, confidential, transfer, medicines, Luxembourg, Dr. Theo, Grandma Ruth. She wrote down everything she could remember, the fragments of that terrible conversation, as if by putting it on paper, she could somehow understand or exorcise the evil she had just witnessed. She fell asleep on the notebook, exhausted, her childish mind burdened with a secret too heavy for her few years of life. In the days that followed that night, Emily became an even more attentive and discreet observer. Every gesture Ruth Langston made during her visits, every interaction Dr. Theo March had with Garrett, every medication he administered was recorded by her discerning eyes. She began to notice that after the psychologist's visits, Garrett seemed more confused, more lethargic, and she noticed that the bottles of medicine on Garrett's bedside table were sometimes subtly swapped for very similar ones, but with slightly different labels, a swap that would surely go unnoticed by someone already weakened by pain and medication. Emily began to put the pieces of this macabre puzzle together, and the picture that emerged was that of a cold and calculating conspiracy where greed was disguised as care and medicine was used as a weapon. The little improvised detective began to record her observations more systematically. She wrote down in her notebook the times when Dr. March visited Garrett, the color and shape of the pills she saw, the words she managed to catch from the conversations between the doctor and Ruth Langston when they thought no one was around. She drew the medicine bottles, trying to reproduce the labels, and even the times when Garrett seemed most sleepy or disoriented. Her sketchbook, once a refuge for her childish imagination, became a secret dossier, a record of the plot that unfolded silently in the corridors of that opulent mansion. Fear accompanied her constantly, but her concern for Garrett, that sad and lonely man who, despite everything, was responsible for her having a roof over her head and food, was even greater. The first person Emily tried to confide her fears to was her mother, Sarah. One night, as Sarah was putting her to bed, the girl, her voice choked and her eyes filled with an anguish that belied her age, tried to explain what she had seen and heard. She talked about the conversation in the office, about the mixed-up medicines, about the plan to make Garrett appear ill. Sarah, exhausted after a long day of work and overwhelmed with her own worries, listened to her daughter with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. She thought it was the fruit of the fertile imagination of a lonely child, perhaps influenced by the heavy atmosphere of the house and by the stories she might have heard from the other employees. "My dear," Sarah said, stroking her daughter's hair, "I think you are confusing things. Mr. Garrett is very ill because he misses Mrs. Amelia, and Dr. March and Mrs. Ruth are only trying to help him. Don't worry about these grown-up things. Okay?" Her mother's disbelief was a hard blow to Emily. She had hoped to find an ally in Sarah, someone who could confirm her suspicions or at least listen to her more carefully. But Sarah, in addition to not believing the gravity of what her daughter was reporting, also felt a paralyzing fear of losing her job. Accusing her boss's mother and his private doctor of such a serious conspiracy based on the words of a 7-year-old child would be the quickest way to be fired. Back to uncertainty and poverty, and she couldn't afford that luxury, not with Emily depending on her. So, even though a small seed of doubt had been planted in her heart by her daughter's words, Sarah opted for prudence, for denial. She asked Emily to forget about those ideas and not to tell anyone else, so as not to cause problems. Feeling alone and misunderstood, but even more determined to do something, Emily realized she would need a different approach if she wanted to warn Garrett. She couldn't just tell him what she had heard. He would probably react like her mother, dismissing it all as childish fantasy, especially coming from a girl she barely knew and who already lived under the stigma of a past in foster care. She needed something that would make him stop and think, that would make him question the very reality that was being imposed on him. It was then that she had an idea that involved her sketchbook and her ability to transform observations into images and words, even with the simplicity of her young years. She would use the language she knew best to try to reach this man, locked in his own pain. Over the next few days, Emily devoted herself to preparing her message for Garrett. Using a pair of blunt scissors and a tube of glue, she began to cut out from old magazines and newspapers in the pantry the words and phrases she had jotted down in her notebook, the ones she had heard in Ruth's conversation with Dr. March. Legal incapacity, interdiction, secret, transfer, fake drugs, obstruction of lucidity. It's not you, it's him. With admirable patience and concentration, she pasted these words into her drawings, creating a kind of narrative collage, a visual story that she hoped would convey the urgency and gravity of her discovery in a way that Garrett could not ignore. It was a desperate attempt, a cry of warning disguised in the innocence of childish work. Choosing the right moment to approach Garrett was crucial. Emily knew that he spent most of his time in his office and rarely emerged before dusk. She waited for an afternoon when the house seemed quieter than usual, when neither Ruth nor Dr. March were present. With her sketchbook clutched tightly in her small, sweaty hands, she climbed the imposing oak staircase, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She stopped in front of the massive door to Garrett's office, a door that had always seemed so intimidating, so forbidding. She took a deep breath, summoned all the courage she could muster, and knocked softly 3 hesitant knocks that barely echoed in the silence of the hallway. A tired, drawling voice came from inside the office. "Who is it?" It was Garrett's voice, sounding more distant and fragile than Emily had ever heard it. "It's me, Emily," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence, and Emily thought he wouldn't let her in. But then she heard the sound of slow footsteps approaching and the doorknob turning. The door opened slightly, revealing the pale, bearded face of Garrett Langston. His eyes, sunken and dull, fixed on the small figure before him with an expression of surprise and slight irritation at having been interrupted in his solitude. "What do you want, girl?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Emily felt a shiver run through her, but she didn't back away. It was now or never. I drew some pictures," Emily stammered, holding out the notebook to him. "I wanted to show you." Garrett looked at her impatiently, clearly not interested in seeing childish scribbles. He was about to dismiss her with some excuse, to send her to find her mother or the housekeeper, when something in her gaze stopped him. There was an urgency there, a seriousness that was at odds with the triviality of showing her drawings. And then there was the notebook, which she held so tightly, as if it were the most precious object in the world. With a resigned sigh, more out of weariness than curiosity, he took the notebook from her hands. "Okay, come in," he said, opening the door wider and allowing Emily to enter the sanctuary of her grief. Garrett's office was a dark and austere place, the walls lined with books that looked untouched in years, the large mahogany desk covered in a fine layer of dust, the heavy curtains blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and an almost palpable sadness. Emily entered with hesitant steps, taking everything in with her watchful eyes. Garrett sat heavily in his leather chair, Emily's notebook on his lap. He opened it without much interest, expecting to find the typical drawings of a 7-year-old, crooked houses, smiling suns, stick figures, and indeed, the first few pages contained these. But then he began to turn the pages, and his expression changed. Amidst the colorful lines and childlike shapes, words and phrases appeared, cut out and pasted together in seemingly random fashion, but which, to Garrett, began to form a frightening pattern. Legal incapacity next to a drawing of a sad man in bed, medication circled in red next to a figure that resembled Dr. March. Confidential transfer written in letters of varying sizes over an image of a safe. And then the sentence that made his blood run cold, written in Emily's hesitant but forceful handwriting, next to a drawing that represented him. "I know you think you're getting sick, but it's not you, it's him." Below the sentence, a drawing of Dr. Theo March, with an expression that Emily had tried to make seem sinister, At first, Garrett's reaction was one of confusion, then a slight irritation. He thought it was just a child's overactive imagination, perhaps influenced by conversations she shouldn't have heard or by a movie she'd seen. Kids make things up, he thought. He was about to close the notebook and dismiss Emily with a formal thank you when his eyes fell on some more specific notes, almost hidden in the corner of a page. Precise dates and times next to the words new medicine or visit Dr. Theo. And those dates and times coincided eerily with the days when he'd felt worst, most confused, most detached from reality. They coincided with the bouts that Dr. March had diagnosed as part of his acute depressive episode. Something inside Garrett, a spark of his old analytical mind, of his survival instinct that had seemed dormant for a year, began to awaken. He reread the cut-up words, the childish notes, and a new perspective began to form. This was not just fantasy. There was a disturbing logic to it, a consistency that could not be ignored. He looked at Emily, who was watching him silently, her eyes apprehensive but steady. "What does this mean, Emily?" he asked, his voice more serious now, more alert. "Where did you get those words from?" And the girl, with disarming simplicity, told him about the conversation she had overheard behind the stairs, about the plan of his grandmother Ruth and Dr. March to declare him incompetent and take his assets. She told him about the medications she suspected were being mixed up, about her fear for him. Garrett listened to Emily's story with a mixture of growing horror and a strange sense of validation. The pieces began to fall into place. His mental confusion, his memory lapses, his consuming apathy, all of which he had attributed to grief and depression, now took on a much more sinister tone. Could it be that his own mother and his therapist were conspiring against him? In such a cruel way. The idea was monstrous, almost unbelievable, but the sincerity in Emily's eyes, the precision of some of the details she related, planted a seed of doubt that began to germinate quickly in his mind. He remembered how controlling Ruth had always been, how she seemed more interested in the winery's financial reports than in his emotional well-being, and Dr. March, with his excessive calm, his increasingly grim diagnoses. For the first time in months, Garrett Langston felt an emotion that wasn't sadness or apathy. It was anger, a cold, calculating anger that was beginning to clear the fog in his mind. He looked at the bottle of pills on his desk, the same ones Dr. March had prescribed for him that morning. With a sudden decision, he stood up, went to the bathroom next to his office and emptied the entire contents of the bottle into the toilet, then flushed the toilet. He wouldn't take those pills again, not without first investigating the accusations of this brave little girl in depth. "Emily," he said, turning to her, his voice now firm with a trace of its old authority. "What you've told me is very serious, and I need you to help me find out the truth. Would you dare?" The girl's eyes lit up. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I'll help you." At that moment, an unlikely alliance was sealed in that dark room. The reclusive millionaire and the housekeeper's little daughter, united by a secret and the search for the truth. Garrett knew he had to be extremely cautious. If Ruth and Theo suspected he was suspicious, they could accelerate their plans or destroy evidence. He instructed Emily to continue acting normally, to not show that she knew anything, to continue observing and, if possible, to try to get more information, but without putting herself in danger. He, in turn, would do the same. He would pretend to continue taking the medication. He would keep his sessions with Dr. March, but his eyes and ears would be more attentive than ever. The hunt had begun, and the prey, unbeknownst to them, were also the hunters. The days that followed were a constant, silent tension in the Langston mansion. Garrett, freed from the effects of the drugs that were numbing him, began to see more clearly the subtle manipulations of his mother and Dr. March. He noticed how they steered their conversations toward his supposed instability. how they interpreted any sign of sadness or fatigue as evidence of his mental decline. He watched the knowing glances they exchanged when they thought he was not paying attention, and he felt his own mind growing clearer, sharper, with each passing day without the adulterated drugs. The fog that had enveloped him for so long began to lift, revealing the dark landscape of the conspiracy that surrounded him. Emily, in turn, became a surprisingly efficient spy. Using the excuse of playing in the hallways or helping her mother with small tasks, she managed to be close to Ruth and Dr. March at strategic moments, capturing fragments of their conversations, observing their movements. She discovered that Dr. March took notes on a laptop that he never left unprotected, and that Ruth Langston received frequent visits from lawyers and financial advisors who were not the same ones who traditionally served the Montero family. Each new piece of information was carefully recorded by Emily in her notebook, which now contained a veritable dossier of the conspiracy, with drawings, keywords, and even small diagrams that she created to try to understand the connections between people and events. One afternoon, while helping her mother tidy up the guest room that Ruth Langston used when she stayed at the mansion, Emily found, hidden in the back of a drawer, a set of documents that caught her attention. They were copies of medical reports on Garrett, with recent dates, but with diagnoses and prognoses much more pessimistic than those that Dr. March usually discussed openly. There were also drafts of legal petitions with terms like provisional guardianship and administration of assets by third parties, and Ruth Langston's name appeared as the main beneficiary and claimant. Emily, her heart pounding, discreetly photographed these documents with the old cell phone that her mother had given her for gaming, and later showed them all to Garrett. The evidence was overwhelming. The documents Emily had found confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Ruth and Theo's plan to declare him legally incompetent and take control of his estate. The pain of his own mother's betrayal was a profound blow to Garrett, but the clarity he now had about the situation gave him the strength to not succumb. He realized that he needed to act with even more intelligence and strategy. It was not enough to simply defend himself. He needed to gather irrefutable evidence of the bad faith and manipulations, and perhaps, just perhaps, discover the truth about the accident that had taken his beloved Amelia. The suspicion that his wife's death had not been accidental, but rather part of that sordid plan, began to take shape in his mind, making everything even more urgent and dangerous. Garrett decided he needed outside help, someone he could trust who could discreetly investigate his mother's and Dr. March's recent past and finances, and who could also re-examine the circumstances of Amelia's death. He remembered an old college friend, David Lee, who had become a renowned private investigator in San Francisco, known for his discretion and efficiency. He contacted David, gave him a brief version of the situation, omitting Emily's role to protect her, and hired him to begin a parallel, secretive investigation. While David worked in the shadows, Garrett and Emily would continue their surveillance inside the mansion, searching for any new evidence that might strengthen the case against the conspirators. David Lee's investigation began to yield surprising and disturbing results. He discovered that Dr. Theo March was not the renowned psychologist he appeared to be. His professional record was marred by allegations of misconduct and manipulation of vulnerable patients, cases that had been cleverly covered up by financial arrangements. And, most shockingly, David found suspicious financial connections between Dr. March and Ruth Langston, with large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts shortly before and after Amelia's death. The web of deceit and crime proved to be even more complex and long-standing than Garrett had imagined. With each new discovery, his wife's death took on a more sinister tone. Meanwhile, Emily, with her childlike curiosity and ability to be in the right places at the right time without being noticed, made a crucial discovery. She noticed that Dr. March, during his therapy sessions with Garrett, would often leave his doctor's bag unattended briefly when he went to the powder room. On one such occasion, while her mother, Sarah, distracted the doctor with a question about the tidiness of his office, Emily, with impressive agility, managed to open the bag and photograph with her cell phone the contents of some documents and a small digital recorder that was inside. She didn't have time to see everything, but what she did capture could be vital. She gave the images to Garrett that same night. The contents of the digital recorder and the documents photographed by Emily were the missing piece of Garrett's puzzle. There were recordings of conversations between Theo March and Ruth Langston in which they openly discussed the details of the interdiction plan, the handling of Garrett's medications, and most chillingly, veiled comments about the incident with Amelia, suggesting that they had somehow facilitated the circumstances that led to her fall from the horse. There were also copies of emails exchanged with Vanguard Equine, the company responsible for the horses on the property, indicating that the animal Amelia was riding on, the day of the accident, had recently been treated by an unknown veterinarian recommended by Ruth, and that it had been acting unusually agitated in the previous few days. The pain and fury that took over Garrett as he listened to those recordings and read those documents were indescribable. His beloved Amelia had not only been the victim of an accident, but most likely a covert murder, orchestrated by her own mother and the man who was supposed to be looking after her mental health. The enormity of those revelations almost made him lose control, but Emily's worried gaze, watching him silently, brought him back to reality. He couldn't break down now. He needed strength, clarity, to bring those criminals to justice and to protect his daughter's future. Yes, because Emily at that moment was already in his heart, his true daughter, the heir to his love and loyalty. Sara Delgado, Emily's mother, who had initially been reluctant to believe her daughter's suspicions, was now faced with the harsh reality. Seeing Garrett's anguish and the evidence Emily had collected with such courage, she was filled with remorse for her initial disbelief and admiration for the little girl's strength and intelligence. She decided that she would no longer remain on the sidelines of this story. She remembered some documents that Ruth Langston had asked her to store in an old safe in the least used wing of the mansion. Documents that the matriarch had said were unimportant family records. Sarah suspected that they might contain something relevant and, with the help of Emily, who knew every secret passage in the house, she managed to gain access to the safe. The documents Sarah and Emily found in the old safe were the icing on the cake that was missing to incriminate Ruth and Theo. There were Amelia's life insurance policies with suspicious clauses, contracts transferring property to shell companies in tax havens, and compromising correspondence between Ruth and lawyers specializing in fraudulent interdictions. It was all there, material proof of the greed, coldness and cruelty of the Langston matriarch and her accomplice. With that complete dossier in hand, Garrett, Emily, Sarah, and investigator David Lee had all the weapons they needed for the final confrontation. It was time to bring the truth to light and bring justice for Amelia and for everything Garrett had suffered. The stage chosen by Garrett for the big reveal was a business dinner that Ruth Langston had organized at the mansion itself, attended by bankers, investors, and influential figures from Napa Valley society. Ruth intended to use the event to subtly begin to prepare the ground for Garrett's necessary interdiction, painting a picture of his emotional fragility for the guests. Little did she know that she was walking directly into the trap that her son, with the help of a 7-year-old girl, had so cunningly set. Garrett, who everyone expected to see dejected and confused, appeared in the room with a firm posture, a determined look in his eyes, and a serenity that surprised everyone, especially his mother and Dr. March, who exchanged apprehensive glances. During dinner, after the formal speeches and the formal toasts, Garrett asked to speak. A curious silence fell over the room. Everyone expected a melancholic or perhaps confused speech from the reclusive millionaire. But what followed was a calm, clear, and forceful exposition of the entire plot hatched by his mother and Dr. Theo March. With the help of a large screen discreetly installed in the room, Garrett began to present the evidence: Emily's recordings, the documents found in the safe, the reports from David Lee's investigation, the evidence of the manipulation of his medications, and the possible induced accident of Amelia. With each new revelation, shock and disbelief took hold of the guests. Ruth Langston turned pale, and Dr. March began to sweat coldly, realizing that the game had taken a disastrous turn for them. The climax of Garrett's presentation came when he called Emily to his side. The girl, clutching her sketchbook, stepped onto the small makeshift stage with a dignity that belied her youth. Garrett, his voice choked with emotion, told everyone how that small, silent observer had been the first to see the plot, the first to have the courage to warn him, the true heroine of the story. He showed Emily's collages, the cut-out words that had been the beginning of his own rediscovery. "This girl," Garrett said, embracing Emily, with her purity and her intelligence, saw the truth that all of us supposedly wiser adults refused to see. "She saved me, not only from a financial conspiracy, but from myself, from the darkness in which I had lost myself." The commotion in the ballroom was immense. Some guests wept openly, others looked at Ruth and Theo with a mixture of contempt and horror. Garrett then made his final announcement, the one that would seal the fate of his empire and the future of his family. "In light of all this, I have made a decision. The majority of my inheritance, control of Langston Winery, and the rest of the family's assets will not be subject to dispute or greed. It will be donated in full to the creation of a foundation dedicated to early childhood education and the support of children who have been victims of neglect and abuse. A foundation that will bear the name of Amelia Langston and that will have as its honorary advisor and inspiration this young woman here." He pointed to Emily. "Because the only person I trust today unconditionally is this 7-year-old girl who taught me the true meaning of loyalty, courage, and listening." The impact of those words was devastating for Ruth and Theo and deeply moving for everyone else. Before they could react or attempt to escape, the doors to the ballroom opened and the police, who had been discreetly called by David Lee, entered and arrested Ruth Langston and Dr. Theo March on charges of attempted estate fraud, false information, and complicity in manslaughter for Amelia's death. The scene of the two being handcuffed and led out of the mansion under the astonished gaze and flashing cameras of the few journalists who had gained access marked the end of an era of manipulation and the beginning of a new era for the Langston family and for Napa Valley. In the months that followed, the Langston case dominated the news. The investigation confirmed every detail of the conspiracy, and Garrett's courage in exposing his own mother and the therapist, and especially Emily's key role in uncovering it all, were widely publicized. Ruth and Theo faced a trial that exposed the sordidness of their actions, culminating in their convictions and the confiscation of the assets they had tried to embezzle. For Garrett, there was no joy in his mother's downfall, only the sadness of a family relationship torn apart by greed, but also the relief of justice and the feeling of having honored Amelia's memory. His greatest concern, however, was for the well-being of Emily and Sarah. Sarah Delgado, who had witnessed her daughter's extraordinary strength and intelligence with a mixture of amazement and pride, finally saw Emily with new eyes. She realized that the girl was not just a curious child, but a being of rare insight and courage. Her initial remorse for not having believed her gave way to deep admiration and a desire to further strengthen the bond between them. Garrett, recognizing Sarah's importance in Emily's life and his own integrity throughout the process, insisted that she remain in the mansion, no longer as a simple housekeeper, but as a friend of the family, an essential figure in the new configuration that was taking shape. Emily, the little heroine of that saga, received not only public recognition, but also the love and security of a true home. Garrett, fulfilling his promise, established the Amelia Langston Foundation for Children's Education, and as a gesture of deep gratitude and affection, granted Emily a lifetime scholarship, ensuring that she would have access to the best possible education and could fully develop her talents. More than that, he welcomed her as an essential part of his life, and although the formal adoption was a complex process that the future would tell in their hearts, they were already a family. Emily came to live in the Langston mansion not as the daughter of the governess, but as the honorary guardian of the property, the symbolic guardian of the legacy of honesty and courage that she herself had helped to restore. Langston Winery, under new interim management overseen by Garrett and an ethics board, was preparing for its next phase as part of the foundation. The focus had shifted from maximizing profits to producing quality wines with social and environmental responsibility, with a portion of the proceeds going toward educational projects. Garrett, while removed from day-to-day management, found new purpose in dedicating himself to the foundation, traveling the country to learn about inspiring initiatives and to ensure that Amelia's legacy was honored in the most meaningful way possible by transforming the lives of other children. The story of Emily, the girl who listened at doors and unraveled a conspiracy with her drawings and intuition, has become a legend in Napa Valley and beyond. She was living proof that the wisdom of childhood, often overlooked by adults, carries a purity and clarity that can see through the thickest curtains of deception. Her quiet courage and ability to turn observations into action have inspired many to pay closer attention to the small voices, to the giant truths they often carry, but which the adult world, in its haste and arrogance, so often forgets to hear. For Garrett Langston, the journey had been from profound darkness to unexpected light. The paralyzing grief that had consumed him over the loss of Amelia had given way to a new way of honoring her memory, not through isolation and pain, but through action, generosity, and building a better future for other children. He learned the hard way about the fragility of trust and the brutality of betrayal, but he also discovered in the purity of a 7-year-old girl the redemptive power of true listening, of fatherhood that comes from the heart, and of the hope that lies in the simplest acts of courage and affection. Sara Delgado, along with Emily, has also found her own path to growth and fulfillment. With the financial security provided by Garrett's gratitude and her daughter's scholarship, she was finally able to return to her studies in child psychology, inspired by Emily's journey and a desire to help other children find their voice and overcome their trauma. She has become an advocate for the importance of validating children's feelings and perceptions, and her relationship with Emily, once marked by a mother-daughter hierarchy, has transformed into a partnership of mutual admiration and complicity. The Langston mansion, once a place of cold hallways and heavy silences, had become a home where joy and hope once again flourished. The gardens, once a scene of melancholy beauty, now echoed with the laughter of Emily and other children who participated in the foundation's early programs, who often used the property as a space for playful and educational activities. Garrett was often seen there, no longer as the reclusive millionaire, but as a kind host, a mentor to the young, a man who had found his smile and the sparkle in his eyes again, alongside the girl who had taught him to see beyond the shadows. And so, the voice Emily had heard behind the door, the one that whispered plans of greed and betrayal, was silenced by the even greater force of truth and innocence. The small, silent observer, with her sketchbook and her childlike courage, had not only saved a man and an empire, but had also planted seeds of hope and transformation that would continue to flourish for many. many years to come. Their story, born amidst vineyards and secrets, became a lasting reminder that even in the darkest plots, a small light of purity can be enough to illuminate the path and rewrite destiny, one drawing at a time, one word at a time, one gesture of love at a time. The years that followed cemented the transformation of everyone involved. Emily, with her sharp intelligence and natural empathy, became a young advocate for children's rights, dividing her time between advanced studies and her active involvement in the Amelia Langston Foundation. Her unique perspective, that of someone who saw the adult world through a crack and understood its complexities ahead of time, made her a powerful and respected voice in forums on education and child protection. She never lost her observant essence, but now used her silence not only to understand, but also to amplify the voices of those who were rarely heard, transforming her childhood notes into speeches that inspired and mobilized. Garrett Langston, for his part, found in philanthropy a purpose that far transcended the business success he had once so longed for. The foundation became his life's work, a legacy built not on numbers, but on the positive impact on the lives of thousands of children. He learned to delegate, to trust, and most importantly, to connect emotionally with the people around him. The father figure he became for Emily was his greatest achievement, a relationship of love and complicity that healed the wounds of his own past and brightened his days with a calm and constant joy. The winery, now under the management of the foundation, thrived with a new ethical and sustainable business model. Its wines carrying not only the Langston tradition, but also the soul of a new era of responsibility and hope. Sarah Delgado, a psychology graduate, became a key player in the Amelia Langston Foundation's therapeutic programs, working directly with children who, like her daughter once did, needed a safe space to process their experiences and develop their potential. Her journey from newly hired housekeeper to accomplished professional and proud mother was an inspiration to many women. Her relationship with Garrett and Emily evolved into a strong and affectionate family bond, where mutual respect and admiration were the foundation of a harmonious and happy coexistence. She had proven to herself and to the world that the strength of a mother and the intelligence of a daughter could, together, move mountains and rewrite destinies. The Langston Mansion, once a place of secrets and sadness, became a center of gatherings and celebrations, where the laughter of children mingled with the animated conversations of adults and the aroma of wines that now symbolized renewal and hope. The somber portraits of ancestors seemed to smile more lightly, witnesses of a new generation that knew how to honor the past without allowing itself to be imprisoned by its mistakes. Garrett's office, once his refuge of isolation, was now a shared workspace with Emily, where ideas for new projects for the foundation were born amid drawings, books, and a complicity that dispensed with words. That place, once somber, had become the beating heart of a new beginning. The case of Ruth Langston and Dr. Theo March served as a warning to Napa Valley society and the corporate world about the dangers of unbridled greed and manipulation disguised as care. Their convictions were a milestone in the fight against asset fraud and abuse of the vulnerable. But beyond the justice of the courts, the greatest lesson of that story lay in the transformative power of truth and the capacity for redemption that exists in every human being willing to listen to the voices of conscience and the heart. The memory of Amelia Langston, previously obscured by pain and suspicion, could finally be celebrated in its fullness through the actions of a foundation that bore her name and her spirit of generosity. Emily, even as she grew into a young woman recognized for her social and intellectual contributions, never forgot the 7-year-old girl who once hid a sketchbook under a ladder. She kept that notebook as her most precious treasure, a constant reminder of her journey, of the importance of observing the world with attentive eyes and an open heart. and of the power that resides in the simplest truths, often spoken in whispers or scribbled in childish strokes. It was the materialization of her own voice, the one that, even when small, had been able to unlock secrets and change the course of many lives, starting with her own. And when Garrett looked at Emily, he saw not only the daughter that fate had brought him so unexpectedly, but also the personification of hope and second chances. She had taught him that true wealth lies not in vineyards that are lost from sight or astronomical bank balances, but in the ability to love, to trust, and to let oneself be transformed by human connections. He had learned that even after the most painful losses, it is possible to find a new meaning in life, a new purpose that brightens the days and warms the soul. And that purpose, for him, had the watchful eyes and wise smile of the girl who one day knocked on his door with a sketchbook in her hands. Langston Winery continued to produce exceptional wines, but now each bottle seemed to carry a bit of that story of overcoming, resilience, and love. Visitors who toured the vineyards and tasted the fruits of that land did not know all the details of the family saga, but they could sense in the atmosphere of the place, in the dedication of the workers, and in the quality of the products, something different, a renewed soul, a commitment to excellence that went far beyond the palate. It was the taste of truth, justice, and hope, bottled with the same passion with which Garrett and Emily had rebuilt their lives. And so, in Napa Valley, where the sun gilded the hills and the wind whispered secrets among the vines, the story of Garrett, Emily, and Sarah became one of those stories that are passed down from generation to generation, not as a fairy tale, but as a true testament to the power of observation, courage, and the human capacity to find light even in the deepest darkness. The voice behind the door, once a harbinger of danger and betrayal, had become the distant echo of a battle won, a reminder that no matter how sophisticated the plans of evil, they will never be able to silence the power of truth spoken with the purity of a child's heart. Life had finally found its balance, not a static and immutable balance, but the dynamic and vibrant one of the vines that renew themselves with each season, always ready to offer their best fruits after facing the rigors of winter and the uncertainty of spring. Garrett, Emily, and Sarah, each in their own way, had found their most precious harvest in the bonds that united them, in the family they had formed, and in the legacy of transformation that, together, they were building. And the silence in the Langston mansion was no longer one of mourning or seclusion, but rather the contemplative silence of those who have learned to listen to the most subtle melodies of existence, those that only reveal themselves to attentive hearts and souls, willing to see beyond appearances.